purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny.
Hello and welcome to Freethought Forum. I'm Fahringer, the producer of this show and your host for this program. I do this program to get myself educated, to tell you the truth, and today I'm hoping to become educated on the subject of liberation theology. And I have with me as my guest Tom Keene from the Our Lady of the Lake. He teaches religious studies, correct, Tom? And with me also is a fellow freethinker, Charles Compton. And the three of us are going to talk about liberation theology. So, I'm a little confused. I've heard about South American things. That's where I was first attracted to the expression. But I'm unclear as to exactly what it means. It seemed to me, now let me just go through my little amateur thing, that it was priests and nuns who really don't seem to think the way the church thinks, that they're off doing good things, the real things that were supposed to be done by churches instead of all the fake stuff. Is that sort of on the order of...
Well, that's a nice stereotype. But that kind of... probably is more suitable to a Hollywood movie.
Oh, okay.
Probably the way to look at it is this. We were talking about dangerous ideas before the program began.
Mm-hmm.
Well, apparently the oppressed people of the world, not just in Latin America, but Asia and Africa as well, have come up with a dangerous idea. It came out of their experience, it came out of their reflection on the experience, and it came out of their reading of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Now these are oppressed people. These are people who have to work like 20 days or 20 hours a day just to begin to make it. People who are driven by economic necessity to the edge of survival. And they come up with a dangerous idea. The dangerous idea is that God, or whatever we want to call this force that drives the universe, is on our side. On our side against the people who are in the big television studios, against the people who decide how the world's going to run. That there's some force that's with us, and we encounter this force every day in our struggle to survive. And this force not only gives us the day-to-day survival, but gives us a sense of meaning, that life has a purpose. And that purpose is really to make a world where there is no oppression.
Wouldn't that be nice? Well, but did this idea, did it start from those people who were working 20 hours a day? If they worked that hard, I don't know how they had time for an idea.
Exactly, right. That's a very, very relevant question to the whole thing about liberation theology. Because these people were doing that. They were raising these things. They weren't sitting around in universities and talking about theology. They were reflecting on their own lives, and this was coming out of their talks around the dinner table, talks around the bar, talks at parties, talks at wherever people gather together and communicate. Talks when they're counseling one another in terms of their grievances, the tragedies of their life. And then, this awareness, this sense of God's presence in their lives begins to be shared with their pastors, with the priests and nuns that you were talking about. Now these people understand theology, and they see that indeed there is a message, a theological message coming through that they hadn't heard when they went to theology school. But they have the sense, the involvement, the connection with the oppressed people, so that they say, wow, this is true. And what happens then is that the pastors begin to, the helpers, the workers, the teachers, the ones who have some education and are interfacing with the uneducated, are being educated by the uneducated. Well, these pastors then communicate in more theological language what they have learned to the theologians in the universities.
All right, yeah.
And now the thing begins to
So-
begins to develop, and there's systems, and theologians are coming down and talking to the poor and getting educated. This develops to the point where, for example, the Vatican says, whoa, wait, there's something dangerous happening here. So the Vatican has issued several pronunciations on it. The typical pronunciation, I think, was done about 5 years ago, and basically says this: well, we look at this stuff and we see there is some truth to it. But we got to be careful. There are some Marxian ideas in here, like Marx's idea that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The Marxian idea that we have to raise consciousness relative to class, that the oppressed form a class, and that they need to raise consciousness as a class, not just as an individual, but that, like in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, the Okies, as they make their way to California, find themselves sitting around a campfire talking. And they each come from different situations, but each has been oppressed by the bank, by the big corporation. And whereas before it was, well, I failed, I was kicked out, I was driven out.
Yeah.
Now it's we are driven out. Okay, so this sense of class consciousness develops, and persons who are more interested in control than they are in liberation, and some of those exist in the Vatican, will caution the liberation theologians. So the documents that come out of the Vatican are kind of cautionary. On the other hand, what's interesting is they can't deny the truth of liberation theology, that God is on the side of the poor when you look at the authentic tradition that's within the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Two examples. The Jewish scriptures and the Jewish history centers on one event. It's a liberation event, the liberation from slavery in Egypt. The New Testament centers around a vision of the reign of God, or the kingdom of God. The idea being that if human beings can let the God force that's within them, that makes them a human family, release itself and we be a family, the world will be different. We won't have this rat race, this dog-eat-dog mentality. And how do we bring that out? Well, we seek God where God is. Now there's one excuse me, New Testament parable, a story, a myth really, that Jesus tells, that I think encapsulates his whole thing. He tells the story of the Last Judgment. And in this story, this great king brings before him all the people of the world. And they are separated on his right and on his left. And on his right hand are these poor people. They didn't know anybody. They had no connections in the world. They couldn't get into the big television studios. And this king says to them, welcome. Welcome to everlasting happiness, because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was put in prison, you came to visit me. I was sick, you came to me. And these people look at this great king and they say, we've never seen somebody like this before. We didn't hang around with kings. They say, well, Lord, when did we do this for you? And he answers, well, when you did it to these, the least of my brothers and sisters, that's when you did it to me.
Yeah.
The other side of the story, which is important for us who are interested in social success and being what our culture defines as important, very important people. Here are the people who are well-dressed, they're fashionable. They have spent their whole lives kissing up to where power is. They are in the courts of the kings. They are on the White House staffs of each administration. And this king says to them, depart from me, you cursed, because I was hungry, you didn't feed me. I was in prison, you didn't come visit me. Now these people had kissed up to kings all their life. And they say, when did we not kiss up to you? He says, well, you didn't do it to the least of these, my brothers and sisters. Now, the story basically, I think, says this. You looking for God? Look for God among the oppressed. That's where God is.
Well,
did you say that the priests don't learn anything in their theological training about helping the poor or helping the oppressed?
Well, there are various theological traditions in the churches. All of them somehow have to find their way into the Bible. They may approach it in various ways, but somehow they got to deal with that. And the thing about liberation theology is that it says to all those different schools of theological thought, there it is. The very source of your subject matter says liberation. Now face up to it. Now a lot of the theological schools will back off. But the truth of it is so compelling to young theologians that as of today, what I hear from other theologians is that in all the traditional schools of theology in Europe, the people who are doing their doctoral degree, most of them are doing it on liberation themes. And if you go to the bookstores, you'll find just a wealth of literature coming out that has liberation themes, done but not just by people who are theologians and are kind of thinking, well, in the realm of ideas, but people who are like biblical scholars, like archaeologists, people who know the ancient languages, people who are into the nitty-gritty, and they're going back to the ancient languages of Europe, of the Middle East, and not just Hebrew, but the languages of the people among whom the Hebrews lived. And they're seeing the struggles for liberation, the political, the economic struggles. And in that context, the liberation themes of the Jewish scriptures, for example, are just blossoming forth. So what the oppressed people were saying is beginning to be reaffirmed by the scholars.
well, that's very nice. But you know what troubles me is you're talking about the Vatican. Their attitude towards birth control and family planning is so bad. In fact, it's non-existent. They're creating.
Let's say it's negative.
Yeah, well, yeah, you could say it's negative. They're creating this.
Yeah.
This thing. It's.
Sure.
Do you see what I'm trying to say? Here are all
Right.
these poor people, and they want, and I think that's right. I think the church has sometimes lost sight of its real mission.
Yeah.
It's setting up itself to make these rules that make people live by that get themselves in a worse mess than they were before. I think it's kind of crazy myself, but I'm glad that some of these young, you say the poor people then go to their parish priest, and then he's the one that sort of started getting. Was there a first one in this? Is there some sort of chronological history to this recent liberation
movement?
Yes.
Yeah. One could put one finger on several theologians. There is a theologian here in the United States who was writing about black liberation theology sometime before it began to be a term in Latin America, and that's a black theologian named James Cone, C-O-N-E. Mm-hmm. So he's got some books out on black liberation theology. The first Latin American proponent to get published here in the United States was Gustavo Gutierrez, who operates in a poor parish as pastor in Peru. I believe it's Lima, Peru. Now, that just represents, those two people represent the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. Writers are coming out all over the world, writing on liberation themes, at all levels of universities, at all levels of the common people. Their works, poetry is coming out. So the literature of liberation theology is vast and rich and beautiful.
Well, what's the time frame? I mean, when did this thing start?
Okay.
Give me a...
Well, if you want to trace the immediate movement, you're going back to the 60s,
okay.
1960s.
That's kind of what I wanted to get a feel for when this thing, because to have these writings now in such a profusion, then it had to have started sometime before day before yesterday.
Yes, right.
So,
exactly.
I was just trying to place it because it's only been really of recent years that I've been seeing that, and I thought I really must try to find out what it really means, and I just didn't. So here you are to educate me on it. So,
One way to get yourself introduced in a very pleasant way is see the film called Romero.
I wondered about that. It came, but it's gone now.
It's in videotape.
Oh, it is? Oh, goody. Okay. That would be pleasant.
Romero tells the story of Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador, who was assassinated, I believe, in 1981 by a death squad of the Salvadoran government. But his life story is I think, exemplary of the liberation movement. He was...
Is that why he got killed?
Yes, very definitely. The story goes something like this. When he was chosen to be bishop, it was because he was a quiet, scholarly, conservative leader. El Salvador was in turmoil. The Nicaraguans had just thrown out the dictator Somoza. They were starting a social revolution. The United States engineered a coup in El Salvador in 1979 to try to do a middle-of-the-road thing so that there would be land reform, and that would obviate a revolution like Nicaragua's happening in El Salvador. Well, the military in El Salvador said a revolution, or a social revolution, or social reform, or land reform over our dead body. So they began simply assassinating anybody who was going along with the U.S. program of land reform. Two U.S. Agricultural consultants were assassinated in the hotel in downtown San Salvador right about that time. That's the Army's way of saying, so much for you people.
Yeah, cool it, kid.
Now anyway, but just about that time, then the Reagan administration comes in and gives them a blank check, gives the government in El Salvador a blank check, just repress any social reform movements. So it's at this time that Romero is beginning to get educated. He's basically conservative, and he has a lot of ties with the ruling elites. But his best priests, who are working with the poor, with the peasants, helping them to even build their own roads so they can get their food to market, something the government isn't doing for them, so they start building their own. And that requires community cooperation. Well, that's dangerous in an oppressive society. So these priests are being killed. As in the process of facing up to this, he sees where God is. God is on the side of the poor here. And the day before he died, he confronted, probably for the 100th time, on radio, the oppressive government. But this time he went a little too far. He said, all you soldiers who are killing our brothers and sisters, these aren't our brothers and sisters. God has told us, thou shalt not kill. I am telling you, do not kill your brothers and sisters. If you are ordered by your commanders to kill your brothers and sisters, do not obey the orders. Obey God. The next day, while he's saying Mass in a small chapel, a very symbolic moment, which the film Romero captures, he, at the moment of the Mass, the key moment of the Mass is the offering of the bread and the wine. This is the giving of life, that we may have life. And at that moment, he is shot through the heart. His life, that sacramental moment, come together. And people remembered after that his words, they may kill me, but I will rise again in the hearts of the Salvadoran people.
Ooh,
that gives you goosebumps.
Yes,
right?
it does.
Right.
All over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got to see that. Did you see that?
No, I've heard about it. I haven't seen it.
I heard about it too, and I've been to maybe 2 movies in 10 years. It takes so much time. Time is something that is hard to come by enough of to go and sit down and watch something happening. And I wish I could be 2 or 3 people is what I wish, really. One of me to go to movies, and one of me to read, and one of me to live. Well, that's... you say it's going on, though, in other areas besides, but the press seems focused on South America. That's been where...
That's where we hear about liberation theology.
Where other, you said in Africa somewhere?
Yeah, right. For example, a couple of years ago, the various churches came together on an ecumenical basis. And in South Africa, they developed what is called the Kairos document. Kairos is a sort of a New Testament Greek word that indicates the full energy of God ready to kind of make action happen. And they basically did an analysis of the apartheid system and talked about how, as Christian churches, they must put themselves on the side of justice. And it wasn't just, well, yes, we must be nice to our black neighbors, or we blacks and whites must be nice to each other. It was a truly revolutionary document saying that we must take this society, which is basically based on greed.
Oh, yes.
And
I won't argue with that.
Yeah, and change that. As long as there's greed going on, we're going to dehumanize one another.
Well, I think it really took hold when the Reagan administration was in doing so many unattractive
At that
things.
point, greed became a virtue.
It did, because no matter what anybody did, you thought they were criminals, and they wound up doing all sorts of wonderful things, having radio shows and going on lecture tours, getting $10,000 a lecture, and I'm astonished by...
There's an interesting New Testament statement that goes like this. It says, when people are praising you and giving you lots of compliments, watch out.
That is interesting.
Because from the point of view of Jesus in the New Testament, the more you climb the ladder of success in terms of what the world wants, you're giving the world what it wants. Well, what is it that the world wants? Number one, it wants you to be controlled by them.
Oh, of course.
It wants you to mute your voice when it comes to justice, especially the injustice of the system. And if you mute your voice diplomatically enough, then you can rise up in the system and you will be honored. And the people who, the Rush Limbaughs, the Gordon Liddies, who get the applause and the popularity, are those who prostitute all truth to the greedy heart, to the fearful heart, to the heart that's homophobic, to the heart that is so fearful of losing what they've got that they can't even contemplate the notion of sharing what they've got with those who are desperately needy. And this is where the popularity of a lot of our reactionary prophets or pundits comes from. As we were talking about a popular, a monopolistic newspaper in our town, you read some of the columnists in there, and basically what they're trying to do is blame the victim. If somebody's poor and out on the street, it's their fault. It's their drugs, or it's irresponsibility, or laziness. They're not out there because there aren't any jobs. If you want a job, you can just go out there and get a job. The fact that we've got millions of Americans chronically unemployed simply because the jobs aren't there, that statistic, the truth of that statistic, does not allow these, how would I say, these persons who pimp for the establishment to reflect on the fact that this hungry person here is truly my brother. That this woman with kids trailing her, begging for food, is my sister. They can't allow that to happen. They can't permit themselves to enter into that kind of empathy, because if it does, then they will have to ultimately not only analyze and reassess and reevaluate their own lifestyle, but the lifestyle of our society.
Well, yes, I thought came to my mind while you were talking about that, our society. It seems to there too put the stamp of approval on all the pettiness and divisiveness, and the churches themselves, I think, are doing a very bad thing in this the homophobic tendencies that they have, and they're passing it on to all the people. They have a big audience. They're on television, and they've got, what do I have? I have this little teeny weeny voice in a little Freethought Forum in Paragon cable access. And that's all. And
well, what you need to do is ask all the viewers to send money here.
You can't do that.
We'll
the
give it
minute-
to God, but send it to our address.
That's the one thing you don't do around here is that. But that's certainly. Go ahead. I wanted to.
Okay. Oh, I was going to say, getting back to El Salvador, when the big shots send these death squads out to kill nuns or priests or whatever, do they tell the soldiers that these are communists? Are they helping the communists? Or
Correct. It's exactly what they tell them.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they make it all into a big communist
Yeah, well, I was
plot.
thinking
Yes.
since they are probably all of those soldiers, they're Catholics, aren't they? And they would be subscribing to that way of thinking. And then why would they turn and kill?
Their own priests.
Yeah, it didn't make any
Right.
sense. But okay,
It takes
so you're
brainwashing.
saying- yeah.
And all those who are watching this who have been in the military can appreciate brainwashing because that's what basic training is. They brainwash you for a period of weeks whereby you think as a soldier. You think, mine is not the reason why, mine is but to do or die. And to the extent that you're a good soldier, you indeed do that. Now, there have been soldiers who have resisted that, but they've been punished.
Oh, of course, I'm sure, or booted out, or whatever.
Sure.
In some way, we can't have. No, I see this terrible dilemma in that things like the military, they have to, in order to get people to do the things that is the military mission, as it were, then they've got to have them united, they've got to have them organized, and they have to have them brainwashed, I
Yes,
guess.
right.
I frankly don't approve of war. I think it's a dreadful idea, and I don't know why we have to have military anyway. But couldn't we all be doing good things for each other and just being nice?
Someday we got to get there, and the sooner we get there, the better.
Well, if it's not sooner, it's going to be too late because things are not looking too good right now. And here's all this crazy stuff going on up in.
I think it's a good point that we're talking about a crisis. That if we act in time, the crisis can turn into an opportunity rather than be a danger. And liberation theology is coming along at a time when a consciousness raising is going on in the world. For just take the ecological aspect of the crisis. We cannot continue killing off nature without committing suicide, kind of
Fighting the
species
hand
suicide.
that feeds you. I mean,
Right.
really.
Right. The human race will not survive unless planet Earth survives. But here we are systematically going along with a socio-economic, industrial, consumer-oriented society that is constantly eating at the life of the planet, poisoning the planet. Unless we change radically our values, our lifestyle, our intentionality, we're going to die as a human race.
I'll try to sell Rush Limbaugh on the idea because he certainly says that planet lovers are crazy.
Yeah. Well,
It's
fine.
very unfortunate. But,
And he gets paid very well to say that.
yeah, isn't it marvelous?
All right, so he's just doing his job. We're running out of time.
Yes, and you know what? That's a good thing you brought that up because we are also running out of time. But what are we going to do about changing people's attitudes? Because as long as you've got the big popular figures spouting this popular notion, because people believe what they want to believe. And that seems to be all for now. And this is Freethought Forum, and we've got to do this again. I am fascinated by the subject. Please tune in again next week. Bye.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Dee-ga-donkin'